Kaufman Fellows Academy, and welcoming back once again Eric Ball, Senior Vice President of Finance at Oracle, but more importantly, the instructor of Mini MBA, Unlocking the Ivory Tower. Welcome, Eric. We're going to be talking
Rusty.
about.
Good to be here.
It sounds funny because the overall title sounds kind of boring, but there's really some fun stuff in when you talk about organization and processes. Let's kick it off and talk about, when you talk about an organization's culture, what do you really mean by that?
Well, it's really the personality of an organization, and Edgar Schein, who really created the field of studying the culture of organizations, defined culture as the pattern of shared basic assumptions that's learned by a group as it solves its problems. And you can call it shared basic assumptions, or you can call it kind of what goes without saying. And it's really central. Every company, every organization has a unique personality, and I think that it's at least as important how an employee fits into that personality as it is whether the employee has the technical skills for the job that they're in. And so there's been a lot of work around the fit between team members and a culture, and also a lot of work in the leadership literature around the leader's unique role in establishing and sustaining a culture for an organization. And some argue that that's the primary thing that a founder in a startup does, is provide the culture that kind of tells people this is how we do things here.
Yeah, I mean, how do you design a culture that's healthy? We've all worked in organizations that had really unhealthy cultures, where it just seemed like nothing was aligned properly. People were unhappy. The morale was bad. That sort of thing. And we've worked in, most of us have worked in companies where it just people got along. People seemed to click. How do you create or design a healthy culture in an organization?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is figure out what the culture is today. In some ways it's easier if you're starting with a blank sheet of paper and you can really think about the kind of culture that you want. But whatever you do to create a healthy culture, you're always going to run into kind of unintended side effects. You want people to have a strong sense of, we are one tribe, we are together, and that can be, that's very helpful, that you want people who are out to change the world and really feel like they're part of something larger and they're part of something great, and that's part of a healthy culture. But sometimes when people attempt to do that, it can slide into unhealthy side effects, and we talk about this a little bit in the book about, some of the pathologies that can arise in corporate cultures.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that sometimes it has a really strong corporate culture, and that too.
I didn't catch all that, Rusty. Who has a strong corporate culture?
I said if we've all worked in organizations that had strong corporate cultures, but what are the dangers of having a very strong corporate culture?
Well, I think one of the dangers is that you can get this isolating culture that becomes so strong that people become removed from behavioral norms that they had before they came into that culture. And one of the early and most well-known academic experiments that really gets at the heart of this danger is the Stanford prison experiment, where a bunch of undergraduates in Stanford in 1971 were told to have a mock prison, and some were randomly assigned to be guards and some were randomly assigned to be prisoners, and very quickly the guards started essentially torturing the prisoners. And what they discovered is that often situations have a bigger impact on how people behave than their inherent personalities do. So when you put people in a situation, it's very common for them to absorb new norms of behavior. That's what happened at Stanford, and that can happen in other environments too. When anthropologists studied Enron, they discovered that Enron fit the textbook definition for a cult. You had a bunch of people that were isolated, and they had this view, it's us against the world, and you had some really bad behaviors which became acceptable that these people might not have engaged in any other environment. And when you look at startups, a lot of startups unintentionally mimic, what an anthropologist would say the definition of a cult is. You have a lot of young people who are sleep deprived, who spend almost all their time together, who are trying to accomplish something, and they have an us against the world mentality. And so you have to be a little bit careful. You want a strong corporate culture, but you have to be careful that you don't sort of swing over the line into some of this cultish behavior. And there are a lot of really interesting examples in the literature of organizations which have tried to build a strong culture and then ended up with behaviors that shocked even the founders of the organization.
Have the designs of organizations or the way people try to design the culture, have they changed being kind of cult-like? How about when an organization has passed that point and is a little more mature? What are there better designs now for trying to design an organization's culture?
Well, I think there are, and there's a lot of recent literature around this, but most of what the literature gets at is figure out what your culture is, be honest with yourself, and then there's some literature around how you go about changing a culture, because it is hard. Once it's in place, it's hard to change, which is why it's so much easier to get it right to start than to change it. But you need to identify any unhealthy elements and convince people that the benefits of change are worthwhile. The reason that's hard is because the losses from a cultural change are certain. Sort of who's going to lose, who's going to be out of power, what ways of making decisions are no longer going to work. It's very clear what the downside of changing is. The upside isn't always clear. And so it really has to fall to the CEO and the most senior people to get behind it and convince people that the likely gains outweigh the certain losses. You see this playing out all the time. CEO of Microsoft recently, because he decided the culture needed to change, and even when he changed, he found that his subordinates were still assuming that he wanted what he had used to want. He decided that the messages had been overly complicated from the CEO's office, and he asked people to provide less detail to him, and then he still got a 47-page document on a simple question, and he said, hey guys, I told you we were going to do this differently, and they said, but this is what you've always wanted. You've always wanted the 47-page document in response to a simple question. And what Ballmer said in interviews is that was his epiphany, that in order to change the culture at Microsoft, he had to remove himself because he was too firmly associated with the old culture that he himself wanted changed. And so he fired himself and said it'll be easier for a new person to make the cultural changes that Microsoft needs. And he even told the new person, what changes he thought were needed, but that he didn't think he could accomplish himself.
Again, we were talking about startups, but they have such a unique phenomenon in our day and age, and often the founders are people that really don't have any business experience, right? So maybe they don't have their MBA and they haven't studied all this stuff. If right off the bat, if a startup has very poor organizational structure, can you save it? Can it be saved? How long? How much does it take to try to rescue something like that? Let's say within the first year you've even just got 10 people. What do they need to do to sort of save that?
Well, it can be saved, but it needs sort of active intervention. And the challenge is that culture is hard to measure. And so a lot of people are focused on revenue metrics, profitability metrics, quantifiable finance metrics. It's hard to measure culture, but it needs to be evaluated. And I think it really is in part the role of the board to say, hey, what is the culture that's been established? Is this the direction we want to go? And it takes a almost more of an artistic mindset than a scientific mindset. But there are some ways that you can go about it. Trice and Beyer did a piece on how you change an organizational culture where they talked about finding propitious moments. And usually it's when the organization's in crisis that people are going to be most responsive to making a change. And if the organization's not in crisis, some people consider putting it in crisis deliberately in order to force the kind of change that's needed long term. There's also a lot of importance behind forms and symbols, particularly by the senior-most people. And so that's why you see a lot of attention paid to things like, does the CEO sit in an office, or are they going to sit out with, in the middle of the workers? Are you going to have cubicles or shared office space? All of those make a statement about how people are expected to work together. How the CEO spends his or her time becomes very important, because nothing speaks to the culture more than how employees see the senior people allocating their time, and also what behavior they reward. Who's hired, who's fired, and who's promoted sends the loudest signal about what is the direction of the culture. And I think you have to think of all of that in terms of what culture do you need for the organization to grow and succeed. And it is hard because so many startups are led by people who don't have as much experience in different organizations, and who may have a lot of passion and may have a lot of energy, but they kind of have to learn some of this stuff as they go.
And you were talking about rewarding behaviors, that often companies and organizations reward behavior that's not really consistent with what their goals are. Why does that keep happening?
Well, yeah, there's a really great piece by a guy named Steve Kerr, who was an academic and ended up working at Goldman Sachs and GE for a while, who talked about the pervasiveness of organizations who say they want one behavior but reward another. If you say you want teamwork, but you force kind of a rank ordering of, a competitive rank ordering of every employee in a group, where you're going to say, okay, there are 5 people in this group, and hey Frank, you're number 4, and so you're going to get rewarded less. You can end up with less teamwork, and you shouldn't be surprised when that happens. And so that's just one small example, but you really need to think about your reward system and how you're compensating people. If you give raises to people and a mediocre performer gets 1% raise and an absolute star gets a 3% raise, well, is that enough of an incentive to put in the time and the effort to excel? A lot of big companies fall prey to kind of rewarding everybody similarly, and therefore destroying the incentive for true superstars to put in the time to excel. So you really have to think about what the compensation plan is, and what you're incenting with annual reviews, raises, stock options, all of that. You also have to recognize that pay isn't always what motivates people, and in fact, the absolute level of what people get paid is a pretty weak motivator for people in terms of organizational incentives. People don't respond to how much money they make in an absolute sense, but they do respond strongly to how much money they make relative to the person who sits next to them. And that's been a key finding of the literature, that it's relative pay matters a lot, even if absolute pay doesn't matter much. And that's a key insight, as well as the fact that most people are motivated by wanting to be part of something large and changing the world. And you don't see many startups saying our goal is to make a boatload of money. You say, hey, we're going to change the world, and that's more successful at attracting top talent than just talking about let's get some stock options and make some money.
We kind of moved through motivation. Let's talk a little bit about power. I mean, what is the secret to success? And yeah, I mean, how do you end up accruing power in an organization?
Power is really an interesting thing, both in practice and in academia, because people don't like to talk about it. But one of the interesting things is in some of the research on power is that a lot of people don't like to talk about power. But if you go into an organization of, say, 100 people and say, who has power in this organization, even among people who are all the same salary grade or rank, there's usually remarkable agreement as to who has the power. And researchers have found they don't even have to offer a definition of power. All they say is who has the power, and almost everyone in an organization agrees on who has the power. So it's obvious, and it has a big impact, even if people aren't always comfortable talking about it. But the research that's been done to say, okay, who has the power in an organization, it tends to be those who've solved the problems that are key to that organization. And that can be different in different environments. In Silicon Valley technology startups, often it's the engineers who have the power because they're the ones who solve the problems that are central to the company's survival. When the car companies were getting bigger in the 50s and 60s, marketing became a powerful part, because they realized that the car companies that had the best marketing campaigns tended to sell the most, and marketing became very important. When companies started growing into conglomerates and you saw some really big corporations that were in a lot of different businesses, and that became more complicated, you saw lawyers, the legal departments ended up with more power, and you saw more CEOs come out of legal. And when you've been in environments where M&A has been a very big part of a corporate strategy, finance has sometimes risen to powerful positions, because the ability to go raise the capital to pay for the mergers ends up being core to the organization's long-term survival. So power is important, and in both in a macro sense and a micro sense, it tends to go to whoever's skill set is most critical to that organization. And that's why you always want to think about how your skill set fits into the larger strategic objectives of where you're working. And if you really want to get somewhere in a company, you want to look for an alignment between what you're good at and what the company needs to survive.
But and you talk about too in the book and all that. It's not just the skill set though. It's figuring out how to solve critical problems, right? I mean, that face the company. If you're the one that can save everybody, then you're going to accrue more power.
Absolutely, and that's why I think a lot of people take on the toughest assignments, because it's not just about whether you work in finance or legal, but whether you can solve problems and whether you can demonstrate that you can solve critical problems. And the people who've solved problems in the past are going to be the ones who have the most influence over other team members going forward.
You talk about influence over team political alliances or solving problems. Is it a combination of the two that really makes somebody powerful in a company?
Well, I mean, politics matters, and politics exists everywhere. So a lot of people, it can really get in your way if you decide that you're too pure for politics, or you're not going to think about it or worry about it. Well, if you don't worry about it, then you're going to lose influence to those who do worry about it. But I'd say that those two things are related, that in most functional organizations, the political power goes to the people who are solving the most critical problems. I mean, you can only get through on BS for a particular period of time, but in most organizations, the politics and the problem solving end up going in the same direction. Not necessarily in the short term, but in the long term.
You were talking about what motivates people, but I think it's kind of surprising to learn that, we all think working at a great place and being happy with your job is going to make you better at your job, but job satisfaction doesn't drive job performance. Why is that?
Well, it used to be assumed that job satisfaction would drive job performance, but there's been a lot of research over the last 30 years which shows there's really no correlation between how satisfied you are with a job and how good you are at it, I don't know that they've figured out why. I think it has to do with the fact, people say that you should do what you're passionate about. There was somebody who came out last year and said that gets it all wrong. It's not that passion drives success, it's that success drives passion. You tend to feel good about what you've succeeded at as much as you succeed at what you're interested in. But whatever the reason, there's been a tremendous amount of research which shows that absolute level of pay does not drive work performance, and job satisfaction does not drive work performance. What has been clearly shown to drive work performance is goal setting. That setting goals leads to better performance, and the more specific and the more challenging the goals are, leads to the highest performance. And that has some implications for organizations. When you're trying to convince people to set really ambitious goals, the idea is if you set a goal that cannot be reached, you're likely to get better performance than if you set an easy goal. And so you want to be very careful about management by objectives, which is usually a process by which employees try to convince their managers that their really easy objectives are actually hard. If you compensate people based on achieving a set of objectives, they're only going to give you easy objectives. And so I think a lot of companies have learned to set impossible goals and reward on the achievement, not on the percentage of goal achieved, but rather the actual achievement, so that you encourage people to set really audacious, challenging goals that may never be met, but you're going to get further than you would have if you set a much easier goal and met that, because people tend to sort of stop trying after they achieve the goal. I think there's a danger with how a lot of companies do performance reviews when they tie compensation to goals and end up with goals that are too easy. But the research on motivation does show that setting goals is the clearest way to get more productivity out of employees. But it also shows that context is important, that people have a lot of subconscious motivations. It's not just, am I happy at my job and do I get paid a lot, but how does my work environment meet my needs for affinity and socialization and feeling like I'm part of something larger. Being fair about how you compensate. I said before that employees are motivated more by relative than absolute compensation. Great piece by Michael Lewis in Liar's Poker where he talks about his first job and he got a bonus of $150,000 and he couldn't believe that he could ever get a bonus that high, and he was very excited. And then he found out that the guy who sat next to him got a $200,000 bonus, and he instantly became enraged and started throwing furniture because he realized that his relative compensation was low. There's other research that shows that people are motivated by recognition, and that if you want more productive employees, simply recognize when they work hard and do a good job. And so there's a lot of ongoing research around motivation, but some of it's counterintuitive, including the bit that absolute pay and job satisfaction don't seem to have much to do with motivating productivity.
we've been talking about incentives and motivation, and you bring up, and others have, that failure is really a great path to learning. But in so many cultures of the world, failure is the absolute disgrace. And certainly still in many companies overseas, failure is absolute disgrace, that sort of thing. Or the people that belong to that organization still feel that. How does a company like overseas try to foster the idea that failure is part of a good process?
Well, for any company, you have to decide what's more important, reliability or resilience. Because if you want reliability, and maybe if you're building nuclear power plants, you're going to want reliability, and you're not going to want to hire somebody who's had spectacular failures in the past, because you want that pattern of success. But if you want the ability to adapt, to be resilient, or to innovate, you have to have people who are comfortable with failure, because none of those things can happen without failure. And I think it is harder in some cultures. This is where the culture becomes important. And a key part of a company's culture is the national culture of its employees. And so the ethnic heritage and the national culture of your employee base can have a lot to do with attitudes towards success and failure. Ideally, what you want is a wide variety of people from different heritages, but there are some countries that don't foster this attitude of failure. One of the reasons that Silicon Valley has been successful is because Silicon Valley honors and treasures people who have failed. I spoke to a venture capitalist in Northern Europe 2 years ago who said that one of the challenges with establishing a venture fund in Finland is that the national culture there tends to be not tolerant of failure. In fact, what he said was people who fail have trouble getting another job, and people who succeed are viewed as pretentious. And so it's hard to cut through that and encourage entrepreneurs in Finland, and that he was trying to say, hey, you need to set aside this element of our national culture if you want to promote innovation and startups. And a lot of different national cultures have those challenges. So what I get out of it is that there are so many places in the world that want to have Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley of Boston, the Silicon Valley of Russia, the Silicon Valley of Israel, and some have been more successful than others. But what they have to realize is you don't just take a research university and put it next to some venture capital and declare yourself Silicon Valley. That attitude toward failure is absolutely key for trying to build an innovation ecosystem.
Well, great, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us again. Eric Ball, the instructor of Mini MBA, Unlocking the Ivory Tower, and also Senior Vice President of Finance at Oracle. And thanks so much for joining us today, Eric, and hope you folks enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks. It's been fun.